My parents kept breaking into my apartment, crossing every boundary I set. So I moved without telling them, letting the silence and their panic finally show them what they had done. The first time I realized something was terribly wrong, I walked into my apartment and smelled my mother's perfume. It was a soft floral scent, heavy on jasmine and impossible to ignore. It clung to the air near my coat rack, a faint, lingering trace that screamed, Marilyn was here. She had been there again. Ada. I was 28 years old, a software engineer with a good job and a downtown apartment in Portland that cost a fortune. But in that moment, standing by the door, I felt 28 feet tall and 6 years old, caught sneaking a cookie. My parents, Marilyn and Edward, kept acting as if my adult life was just a temporary extension of theirs, and that my apartment was still my childhood bedroom. I had been so proud to move out. The walls were a clean white, the floors polished concrete, Boda, and the sound of the city filtering through the tall windows was the soundtrack to my own beginning. It was my space, my order, my meticulously organized freedom. On move, in day, 2 years ago, I remembered the tension. Marilyn had asked for a spare key. Leaning in close, brushing my hair with a hand that was meant to be comforting but felt restraining. Just in case of emergencies, sweetheart, she had said. I had hesitated, the key warm in my hand, but the familiar, sickening pressure of guilt had crept in. The guilt of being perceived as ungrateful or unloving. So I handed it over. I didn't realize then that I had also handed over a piece of my privacy. For a few weeks, life felt normal, almost miraculously peaceful. I got into the rhythm of my job, walked to the coffee shop on weekends, and breathed differently. I thought I had broken the pattern. But the intrusions had started small, insidious. I would find a blanket folded at the wrong angle, or a dish washed and put away in a high cabinet I never used. Sometimes, Bada. There was that faint trace of my mother's jasmine lotion lingering in the air long after I returned from the office. I tried to gaslight myself, hoping I had moved the mug or that the wind shifted the blanket. Denial was easier than confrontation. Then Marilyn began leaving food. It wasn't just a container, it was a full casserole, soups, or dozens of cookies, each item taped with a bright, chipper little note that read, "You work too hard. Eat something real. Love you." The handwriting was sweet, neat cursive that looked innocent. The violation, however, felt violent. Edward backed her completely. When I brought it up one Sunday dinner, he only sighed, waving my concerns away with a dismissive hand. She's just looking out for you, Jackson. You're too busy with that coding stuff to remember to feed yourself. To them, my independence was a phase I was going through, not a fact I had achieved. They saw me not as a man who could manage his own life, but as a project that required careful, continuous supervision. The worst part wasn't the food or the rearranged objects. It was how familiar the feeling was. Suddenly, I was not 28, but 12 again, Boda. Standing in the kitchen while Marilyn rearranged my backpack because she didn't like the way I had organized my textbooks, Boda. I remembered the stinging humiliation of being told my need for privacy was dramatic, and my boundaries were disrespectful. Their love always came with very specific, non-negotiable conditions: access, compliance, and obedience. If I withheld one, I was withholding love. I tried talking to them, repeating the process that always failed. I was gentle first, framing it as a discussion about being an adult. Then I grew firmer, using words like consent and boundaries. Finally, I grew desperate, shouting into the phone only to be met with shocked silence, followed by Edward's disappointed, parental lecture about my tone. Nothing ever changed. If anything, Boda. They became more confident in their entitlement, convinced that I was simply too stubborn to appreciate their help. I wanted to believe they meant well. I wanted to believe I was safe in my own home. But deep down, a truth I had ignored for years was finally becoming impossible to escape. My parents didn't understand boundaries because they truly did not believe I had the right to set any at all. The entitlement was total, and the invasion was only just beginning. I pressed my back against the wall of my pristine apartment, inhaling that faint floral impossibility, realizing I was already losing the battle of my own space. Sabota. The initial traces of jasmine perfume and the subtly moved objects were merely the opening act. Uh, uh. After my failed attempts to communicate my boundaries, the intrusions stopped being suggestions and became statements. The invasion escalated rapidly. I had spent the prior weekend catching up on my backlog. My laundry hamper was full, a colorful mountain of cotton and synthetics that I planned to tackle eventually. It was my mess. One Wednesday evening, I came home after a grueling 12-hour shift. The key turned in the lock, the heavy door swung in, and I stopped dead. Sitting neatly on my duvet was my laundry, freshly washed, dried, and folded. Socks paired, shirts smoothed. Everything arranged with the kind of meticulous, domestic precision only my mother possessed. My chest tightened immediately, cold and hard. I hadn't done laundry in a week. I called Marilyn immediately, my voice low and tight, resisting the urge to shout. "Were you in my apartment today?" She didn't even pause. Her voice was bright, cheerful, utterly convinced of her own rightness. "Of course, honey, your hamper was overflowing. I couldn't leave it like that. You needed clean work shirts. Mom, you can't just come in whenever you want." I paced my living room, adrenaline shaking my hands. "Jackson, don't be ridiculous." She scoffed, lightly. "You were at work. It is not like you were using the place." That sentence, "It is not like you were using the place," was a casual demolition of my autonomy. It hit me harder than any outright argument ever could. It suggested my home was only truly mine when I was physically occupying it, and that my existence only counted when it was convenient for her. The clean, warm scent of the folded clothes felt like a hostile act. A few days later, the scene shifted to the kitchen. Bada. I opened my refrigerator, expecting my usual assortment of takeout leftovers and cold brew concentrate, but everything was rearranged. It was stocked with healthy, meal prep containers, washed and cut vegetables in plastic boxes. Groceries I never bought. Most people I knew would consider this deeply sweet, an act of pure maternal care. To me, it felt suffocating. Bada. Like someone had replaced my lungs with sand. The effort they put into violating my space was more draining than the simple violation itself. Edward offered the same defense. "She worries about your diet, son. You're too thin?" Then came Lily. Boda. I walked into my bathroom early one morning and spotted a bottle of shampoo I didn't recognize sitting on the edge of the tub. It was bright purple, A luxury salon, only brand. I froze. I knew who used that brand, my younger sister, Lily. I grabbed my phone, calling her immediately. Hey, did you stay at my place last night? There was a slight, guilty pause on her end. Yeah, Mom said it was fine. Bada. I had a late shift at the bookstore and didn't want to drive all the way back to the suburbs. What's the big deal? She doesn't live here. Lily, you should have asked me first. She mirrored our mother's dismissiveness perfectly, a chilling sign of how deeply ingrained this behavior was. I mean, you weren't home. What's the big deal? There it was again. They acted as if my consent was merely an inconvenient detail, easily bypassed by their parental authority. Later that afternoon, I drove out to my parents' house, the three-bedroom suburban colonial I grew up in. I drove there with the single, urgent goal of demanding the spare key back and ending the charade. But the moment I stepped inside, the familiar, cozy scent of pot roast and the soft clinking of dishes being set on the table pulled me back into the orbit of my childhood habits. Obedience, guilt, and above all, silence. Marilyn immediately acted wounded by my tone. Edward said I was being paranoid and dramatic about a few groceries. Lily avoided my eyes. I couldn't form the words. The guilt tightened its grip on my throat, choking the resolve out of me. I left with nothing resolved, carrying a cold, knotting despair in my stomach. I was entirely alone in this fight, completely defeated by the weight of their entitlement. I tried one final, desperate measure that night. I contacted a locksmith and changed the locks on both the front door and the balcony door. I told myself, that is it. Problem solved. For a short while, I even started to hope they had finally, somehow, understood. Hope, I would soon learn, was a very fragile commodity around people who refused to see you. Changing the locks felt like a final, desperate act of defense, a physical barrier I had hoped would be undeniable. 2 weeks passed quietly. The silence was palpable, almost dizzying. My apartment remained exactly as I left it. A glass on the counter, the remote on the armchair, a controlled, ordered space entirely untouched. I started to believe they had finally understood the gravity of the situation, or perhaps the sheer impracticality of picking a new lock. But hope, when it came to my parents, was a dangerous vulnerability. One Thursday evening, about 3 weeks after the locksmith had left, I opened my door and stopped cold. Sitting on my couch, comfortable, calm, and sipping a cup of hot tea as if she owned the place, was Marilyn. The shock was total. My mind scrambled, performing an instant diagnostic scan. The door was securely closed. No window was open, no sign of forced entry. How? Marilyn looked up from her tea, smiled brightly, and held up something shiny between her fingers. It was a brand new key, identical to the ones I had just replaced. She looked like a child who had just shared a piece of spectacular good news. Hello, sweetheart, she said, her voice entirely devoid of remorse. I called your landlord. He gave me this. I didn't move. I couldn't speak. The air rushed out of my chest, leaving a hollow vacuum. I needed access in case of emergencies. She continued, setting the key on the coffee table next to her neatly arranged purse. You know how hard it is to get a hold of you during the day. This way, I don't have to bother him if something happens. I heard the words, but they didn't compute as logic. They computed as a profound institutional betrayal. She hadn't just broken a physical barrier, she had circumvented my authority entirely by utilizing a third party. She used the landlord to actively work foul around my boundaries. To Marilyn, Bota. My attempts to control my own life were simply obstacles she felt professionally entitled to manage. Something inside me cracked. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, structural failure, the way ice shears under too much pressure. My fear of confrontation was replaced by a cold, sharp certainty. They would never stop. They would always find another way in, always justify it as being for my own good. I didn't argue, I didn't yell. There was no point. I simply turned around, walked out, and called the locksmith again, instructing him to change the tumbler set immediately and to never share a key with anyone, not even someone claiming to be family, without my express written permission. I offered him double his usual rate for the hassle and the secrecy. I changed the locks again, but this time, it wasn't just the metal mechanisms that changed. Something essential and profound changed in me. The guilt I usually felt when trying to enforce a boundary had finally evaporated. It was replaced by a drained, cold sense of betrayal. The hope that I could stay quiet and still be respected was gone. They had proven, without question, that they valued their control more than they valued my trust. I thought foolishly that nothing could surprise me anymore. Bada. I believed that calling the landlord was the limit of their manipulative capability. I was wrong. The violation that came next showed me just how desperate and entitled they truly were. I had placed a physical barrier between us. They were about to tear a hole in my world to walk right back in. 3 weeks after the landlord incident, my quiet resolution had solidified, though the air in my apartment still felt contaminated by the knowledge of my mother's boundless access. I thought I had accounted for every possible avenue of intrusion. I was catastrophically mistaken. I came home one evening and paused, feeling the immediate absence of stillness that usually greeted me. The apartment felt open. I noticed the living room window first. It was cracked open, maybe 5 or 6 inches, and a soft breeze was pushing the curtains inward. The screen lay awkwardly on the floor like someone had ripped it out in a hurry, leaving fine dust on the sill. At first, my brain offered 1,000 rationalizations. A faulty lock, high winds, perhaps the screen had just fallen out. Anything except the truth that was forming like a thick, paralyzing knot in my throat. Then I saw the casserole on my counter. It was still warm, covered neatly with aluminum foil. A sticky note in Marilyn's neat, cursive handwriting was taped to the top that read, "You are not eating enough. I worry." My stomach dropped with a sickening lurch. There was only one explanation. My door was locked. My new, expensive locks were secure. There was no way in unless someone had physically forced entry. I grabbed my phone and called Marilyn, my voice shaking so badly I had to brace myself against the wall. "Did you climb up to my window?" A beat of complete, chilling silence followed. Then, an almost offended scoff, as if I were the one making the outrageous accusation. "Well, Jackson, your door was locked. What else was I supposed to do? I made you dinner. You climbed a trellis." I whispered, the words barely audible, tasting like dust and anger. "You climbed a trellis to break into my apartment. Don't be dramatic, Jackson, she corrected, her tone exasperated, the tone reserved for the unreasonable child. It was only the second floor. If you would stop changing the locks like some rebellious teenager, I wouldn't have to. I pressed the heel of my hand against my forehead, trying to push the image of my middle, aged mother scaling the side of the building out of my mind. This is illegal, Mom. You broke a window screen. This is motherhood, she corrected, with absolute conviction. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. Boda. When I called Edward, hoping he would finally see the insanity of the situation, he sighed deeply, as if I were the one who had just wasted his time. She worries about you, son. She loves you. Just give us a key. You're making this harder than it has to be. I hung up immediately, before the anger boiled over into something I couldn't take back. It was no longer about a key, or laundry, or even the food. It was the absolute Boda, fundamental belief that they were entitled to every corner of my life, entitled to override every boundary I set, entitled to treat me like property. That night, lying awake with the window locked and the curtains drawn tight, I realized the terrifying truth. I could change the locks 100 times, install better alarms, and they would simply find another way in. A landlord, a window, a trellis, a borrowed ladder. They did not believe I deserved privacy, and as long as they knew where I lived, Bada, they would keep proving it. The only way to restore my peace, to establish a boundary they physically could not cross, was to become entirely unreachable. The clarity was cold and immediate. My fight for control of my life had just become a fight for escape. The terrifying clarity born from the trellis break did not allow for hesitation. If they would break the law, if they would endanger themselves, all to retain control of my space, then my response had to be equally decisive. My fight for boundaries had become a stealth mission for escape. The very next morning, I toured a building in the Pearl District. It was a tall, modern tower made of glass and steel, entirely unremarkable except for one critical detail: security. Every entrance was controlled. At the front desk sat Victor. He was a middle-aged, former military man, uniformed and stoic, who scanned every guest, every package, and every unfamiliar face with an impartial vigilance. He was the embodiment of the boundary I desperately needed. Every detail of the place whispered the single word I needed to hear: safety. I signed the lease that afternoon, almost before the ink dried on the application. The financial cost was high, but the price of remaining in my current apartment was quickly becoming my sanity. For 2 solid weeks, I packed silently. This move was not a celebration of independence. It was a covert military operation. There were no posts on social media, Boda, no moving announcement to friends, and absolutely no rental of a recognizable moving truck. I scheduled my 2 most trusted friends, Sophie and Rachel, for help. They arrived after dark, carrying boxes down the stairs one by one, their whispering encouragement sounding like soldiers helping me escape a war I had been pretending was not actually happening. I felt cold, focused, and entirely purposeful. There was no room for guilt or sentimentality. This was pure self-preservation. Sophie asked me once, stacking a crate of books onto a handcart, "Are you going to tell them where you are going?" I paused, taping up a box labeled electronics. "Not yet," I said, meeting her eyes. They need to find out what it feels like to lose access, not just be denied it. By sunset on the final day, my old apartment was hollow and empty. Every trace of Jackson was gone. The white walls looked colder, the sunlight harsher without my furniture to absorb it. I took a deep, shuddering breath, wiped the dust from the counters one last time, and stood in the doorway. I felt nothing like sadness or nostalgia. I felt relief, profound and absolute. I was simply done with the space and the memories of intrusion it now held. I closed the door behind me, uh, feeling the solid click of the lock, and walked to the residential mailbox slots near the lobby. I dropped the keys to the empty apartment inside the landlord's box. I did not look back. They thought they could enter my life whenever they wanted, walking through my home as if it were an extension of theirs. Soon, they were going to learn what it felt like when I finally permanently shut the door on their access. I walked away, feeling a focused, controlled release. The physical barrier was now complete. The emotional confrontation was still to come, but I would face it from a place of unassailable security. The days immediately following the move were both the most peaceful and the most tense of my adult life. For the first 2 days, my phone buzzed almost non-stop. Missed calls, texts, and voicemails piled up. At first, the messages were deceptively casual check-ins. Guh. How was your day? Call us when you are free. Love, Mom. They were the kind of messages that pretended everything was normal, that I was simply busy, not gone. I didn't respond. Silence, I realized, was the only language they didn't know how to manipulate or override. It was a complete absence of information, which was the only true boundary I had left. By day 3, the tone shifted. The text became shorter, sharper, imbued with a growing edge of impatience and anxiety. Jackson, answer your mother. This is not funny. Call us immediately. Where are you? Edward's voice, too, showed strain in the voicemails, moving from disappointed to frustrated. I continued to resist the pull of guilt. I focused instead on the tangible safety around me. My new apartment was quiet. Boda. I spent hours unpacking, arranging my books on the shelf in a specific order that only I would ever touch or change. I made tea, knowing that the tea kettle was my choice, the milk was my brand, and the sugar container would remain precisely where I had placed it. Each morning, as I passed through the lobby to get coffee, Victor, the doorman, nodded at me. His polite, "Good afternoon, Mr. Jackson," came with a respectful distance my parents had never mastered. He was a human firewall, and his presence allowed my breath to reach all the way into my lungs for the first time in months. I felt a sense of profound, controlled peace. Then, on the 4th day, the notifications stopped altogether. My phone sat quiet on my new kitchen counter, a silent monument to my success. I looked at it several times, half expecting the familiar, demanding glow of a new message, but nothing came. Calm settled in. But calm never holds forever when the central conflict of your life is unresolved. On the 6th day, the silence shattered. My phone erupted, ringing uncontrollably. 20 missed calls in a row from Marilyn. My stomach tightened. Immediately seizing up with fear and adrenaline, I forced myself not to pick up, not to give them the quick release they were seeking. Then another call came through, and this time, the preview of the voicemail that popped up on the screen caught my eye. The text snippet was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. Jackson, your apartment. Everything is gone. Where are you? I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. They were at my old apartment. They had realized. I walked to the large window, overlooking the city, seeing nothing but the distant clouds, yet imagining the scene vividly. The empty living room, the stripped shelves, the bare floors. My parents, standing in the doorway, confronted not just with my absence, but with the stark, empty reality that their actions had created. Another voicemail came instantly. Marilyn's voice was high-pitched, shrill, and completely breaking. Oh God, Jackson, did someone take you? Your things are gone. The place is empty. Please, please call us. Sweetheart. I closed my eyes. This wasn't satisfaction, not exactly. It was a shift, a balance tipping. They weren't in control anymore. They were panicking, and the source of their panic was the boundary I had finally established. I was safe, secured by Victor and the thick walls of the Pearl District Tower, while they were exposed to the terror of their own making. I let another day pass in silence, knowing that the longer I waited, the more powerful my eventual response would be. I let another day pass in the absolute, secure silence of my new apartment. The tension was immense, yet entirely external to me. Bada. Their panic was peaking, my control was absolute. On the third day after they discovered the empty apartment, I finally called them back. Marilyn answered before the first ring could even complete. Her voice was a ragged gasp, stripped of its usual cheerful artifice. Jackson, Jackson, where are you? What is going on? We went to your apartment and it was empty. Do you hear me? Empty. I kept my voice steady, slow, and devastatingly calm. Why were you at my apartment? A stunned silence crackled across the line, heavy with disbelief. Edward's voice burst in then, sharp, with his usual accusation and attempt to reclaim authority. We hadn't heard from you in days. We were worried. We had every right to check on you. No, I said quietly, the word landing like a small, hard stone. You didn't. Marilyn's voice returned, frantic. Jackson, stop this. Tell us where you are. Right now. No. I repeated the word. It was physically impossible for her to process. No, she whispered, the disbelief raw. No, I said again, firmly. You do not get to know where I live. Edward inhaled sharply, the sound loud over the phone. Excuse me. This is insane. We are your parents. And you treated my home like it was yours. I replied, the calm allowing me to list the violations without emotion. You walked in whenever you wanted. You rearranged things. You let Lily stay over without asking. You got a new key behind my back. I paused, letting the next sentence sink in. Mom climbed a trellis, Dad. A trellis. Marilyn gasped, her voice trembling. That was one time. Yes, it was extreme, but we were worried sick. It should never have happened once. I finished. There was a long silence. Not the angry kind they usually used, but the kind that meant they finally heard the truth in my voice because they were confronted with the consequences of their own actions. I continued, delivering the emotional thesis of my escape. You didn't worry about me. You worried about losing control of me. Those are not the same thing. That's not fair. Edward muttered, a desperate, childish defense. Fair, I said. Do you want fair? Fair would have been respecting my boundaries years ago. Fair would have been treating me like an adult. Fair would have been listening when I said no, but you didn't. So now, I am doing the only thing left to protect myself. Marilyn's breathing became ragged and shaking. Jackson, please, just tell us you are safe. Please. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I've been sick with worry. Her guilt tactics, the tears, the emotional spirals, all the things that had always pulled me back into their orbit, washed over me like a wave that finally had no power to drag me under. I simply acknowledged her immediate fear, nothing more. I am safe, I said. But I am safe because I am away from you. She sobbed. Edward whispered something I never expected to hear, his voice hollow. I didn't know it was this bad. I swallowed, the only sign of the internal effort this required. You didn't want to know. For a long moment, no one spoke. They were processing something new, something uncomfortable, something undeniable. I had changed, and the door they once walked through freely was no longer theirs. Marilyn sniffed, recovering slightly. Jackson, please. We just want to talk face to face. We need to see you. Then we can meet in public, I said immediately. A cafe downtown. Neutral space. No more home visits. Ever. You don't trust us, she whispered, wounded. I don't trust your boundaries, I corrected. Because you don't have any. Another silence, but this one felt less like resistance and more like surrender. Marilyn finally spoke the word I needed to hear. Okay. That one word did something small but real in my chest. It was not forgiveness, and it did not erase the past. But it was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was a start. Good, I said softly. I will text you a time and place, and we will talk then. Edward tried one last time, a final, desperate grasp at the old power. But your address. Shouldn't we know where you live in case of an emergency? No, I said, my voice rising slightly, firm and resolute. You will not have a key to my home. You will not have access to my home. My home is mine, he exhaled slowly. Right. And just like that, the balance shifted entirely. The confrontation was over. The silence following the decisive phone call was the sound of a new foundation being set. Boda. I sent the text message detailing the time and location, a small, busy cafe downtown, a completely neutral space with tables far enough apart that we would not have to whisper. I arrived 3 days later, early, choosing a seat by the window where I could see them approach. My hands were not shaking. My stomach was not tight. For the first time in my life, I felt firmly rooted in myself, protected by my own choice and the high-rise I called home. When Marilyn and Edward entered the cafe, they looked different. They were smaller, somehow tired, cautious, stripped of the certainty they had always worn like armor. Marilyn hesitated before sitting down, glancing at the empty chair as if unsure whether she was truly allowed to occupy the space across from me. Edward's shoulders were slumped. The conversation began quietly. There were no immediate accusations and, mercifully, no tears. Only halting sentences and long, uncomfortable pauses. Marilyn spoke first, her voice low. Jackson, I did not understand how suffocating my actions were. I truly thought I was just helping. Edward shifted in his seat. I thought I was protecting you. I realize now I was protecting a version of you that simply does not exist anymore. The adult version. I didn't rush to make them feel better, nor did I smooth over the discomfort. I simply told them the truth. I had finally earned the right to speak. I need boundaries if we are going to have any kind of relationship moving forward. I need to know that no means no. They both nodded, slow, reluctant, but their acceptance felt sincere. We hammered out an agreement in the public anonymity of the cafe. We would meet only in public for the foreseeable future. There would be absolutely no surprise visits, no keys, and no attempt to gain access to my home in any form. Respect goes both ways, I stated clearly, and trust can only be rebuilt with action, not demanded with tears. When it was time to leave, Marilyn reached across the table and hugged me gently, carefully, as if she finally understood I was not something she could hold too tightly. Edward kept his handshake brief but meaningful. As I walked away, Edward whispered, "We will try, Jackson." And for the first time in years, I believed him. I walked back to my new apartment with a lightness I hadn't felt since I first handed over that spare key. The lobby was quiet. Victor greeted me with his usual professional nod. I took the elevator up, the click of the lock on my door feeling heavy, definitive, and protective. As I looked around the room, the soft light spilling across the floor, the books exactly where I left them, the city humming below, I realized something simple and profound. Peace isn't something you find waiting for you, Bada. It is something you must fiercely protect. I used to think love meant allowing everything, even the things that hurt. Now, I knew love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's ownership. By walking away, I finally made room for something healthier to grow, not just with them, but within myself. My world felt sealed, whole, and owned by no one but me. Tadalwal mo rd kuantis, all parts, 7,900 words,